Welcome back to another episode of the Empowered Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamone, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self-acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have a guest with us. His name is Jose Mendoza. He started as a registered cardiovascular invasive specialist, assisting in minimally invasive cardiac surgical procedures. His journey into health and wellness blossomed at the same time. Seeing people return unwell for years drove him into uncovering the deeper reasons behind why. Through rigorous studies, he completed his 4-year, 4,000-hour doctorate in Chinese energetic medicine in 2024, and he's blended ancient healing wisdom with cutting-edge scientific knowledge and guides clients to reclaim their energy, time, and live in a more authentic life. Jose, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Why don't you share a little bit more about yourself with our listeners?
Absolutely. Now, as you already know, my name is Jose, and as you already know, I'm a doctor of Chinese energetic medicine. Now, when I was going through and learning in school for the minimally invasive cardiovascular procedures, is when I was introduced to the Eastern philosophies as well at the same time. Now, growing up, my mother was in the hospital from what I remember quite a bit. This was around the age of 5 or 6. I just remember constantly being in hospitals. And that drove me a little bit to want to work in that field so that I could help people in the same manner that my mother was helped. But throughout my life, as I was going through school and as I was actually working, I always had these Eastern philosophies in the back of my mind. And slowly over time, I was accumulating and learning more and more. Until finally it culminated, which when COVID hit, I had this opportunity to go and take this doctorate program where we did a much, much deeper dive beyond anything I could have imagined. And this finally gave me what I was seeking because I wanted to help people and I wanted to make sure that people got well. But there weren't always moments where I noticed that with the work that I was doing. And so I had a bit of a conflict. It was helpful in some regard because at the time I was actually working in cardiac pediatrics. So then I was watching these kids and they would return and come back, and over time they grew and they were able to live lifespans that they would not have been able to otherwise. But it was the other people that we would see come back again that weren't really getting better. Some of them because they wouldn't give up their smoking habits or they would not change their diets or whatever the case was. So then when the doctorate program presented itself, I took it upon myself. I went, I learned, educated myself, and really found what I was seeking. Because now, whereas before it's let me fix it for you, now it really gave me the perspective of let's work on this together and get you out of this hole. You dug yourself a hole, whether you knew or not. Let's get you out of that. And so now I can extend a helping hand towards those people.
I think that's absolutely beautiful because I think a lot of times today, I've noticed in my own experiences with doctors and everything, it's always trying to fix and solve something for somebody. And I don't feel like we empower them enough to make those choices for themselves and really take on that role of educating and, like you just said, that collectively walking that journey together as a team.
Yeah, and there's a lot to be said with that. Is I don't think it's necessarily a bad path, so to speak, because there's still some benefits that come from it. For example, children that could not live lives beyond, say, a few days after birth could now live for decades, as an example. But it's also partly the system because the doctors don't really have time to sit there and educate the patients. In some situations, the doctor only comes in to do the procedure or just to come in to look over the labs, give you the results, and then leave. Like they don't have the time either. So it's the whole thing, and it's very interesting because when I was in China and I was doing some training over there as well for the Eastern aspect, I would see the acupuncturists and they copied a Western model in the sense that they had multiple patients. A standard acupuncturist would see close to, I want to say it was 30 patients in the span of 2.5 hours. And so the way that they work is also incredibly busy. And they don't have the time, they don't have the space to really sit there and engage with everybody. So I feel that we're a little spoiled here because acupuncturists here, it tends to be one person and you have that full hour, or however long the session is, with that acupuncturist.
That's really incredible to know that, like you said, doctors and even these acupuncturists are working with so many people in such a short period of time. It really makes me wonder, like you coming back to what you just said about working together with these patients and being able to do that in a more close-knit teamwork environment. When you're working with so many people collectively, I can see how that might present some challenges to the quality of care.
Yeah, and even though you do have a leader, and ultimately it's up to the leader's responsibility of the physician, you're only there as an extra pair of eyes, you're only there as an extra pair of hands. Sometimes there is assistance because physician's only one person and they may miss something, and that's why you have extra sets of eyes and hands to help in those situations to say, "Oh, did you notice this?" Yeah, but it partly the system, the way it's designed. Some of these doctors, they're far too busy. Some of them run on far too little sleep, and it's it's also the not so much the education, but the fact that when a physician starts off new, they're also heavily in debt at that time because of medical school, and so they have to do what they can and work as hard as they need to really be able to get to a comfortable place because imagine having more than $250,000 in debt, and then you have to work for so many years to clear that before you're actually able to take a breath.
I can imagine that puts a lot of pressure on physicians as they go through their career practice. Um, I wanted to ask you, Jose, I remember in our pre-interview, you talked about how when you got into Chinese medicine, something deep inside you, grief-wise, unlocked for you, something that was causing issues in your own life, and you started figuring out what that was going through that process. I'd love for you to share that story with the audience today.
Absolutely. Because the way Eastern medicine, Chinese medicine, or any other Eastern philosophy works is we look at the whole thing. And so imagine that you're tending to a garden, and in the garden, you're going to have weeds. You could cut the weed, but it's just going to grow back just like the grass that you cut. To really get rid of it, you have to go deep, find the roots, and yank it out from the roots to really clear it. And that's the way this philosophy works. And that's exactly what happened with me. Because as I mentioned, my mother was in the hospital a lot when I was younger. She was very important to me because earlier in my age, around the age of 2 or 3, somewhere around there, is when she began to go to work. And as she went to work, she would leave me with extended family, and she'd only be gone for 4 hours. But understand that for a child, when we speak of trauma, we tend to think it's this big major thing. But a child that can't process or understand things, anything as minor as mom took my toy away could be considered a traumatic event. And so every day she was leaving, and every day I was accepting that as she's abandoning me because I wouldn't see her. Yes, there was the thought and the knowing that she would come back, but she was still abandoning me every day. That was the perspective. And that came up for me not too long ago as I'm working and doing my own practice, as I'm working to better myself, is when the realization came that I said, oh, this is what has been happening to me for a very long time. And now it's time for me to put in the work to release this because it no longer serves me. It's like an anchor. You're trying to swim up to the surface, but you have an anchor. You can't quite swim against the anchor. You're not strong enough. The only way for you to get back up is to release that anchor. And so I began the process of doing that. And once I went through the process, once I released the grief, once I let go of that to the point that it's now a story, then I had a realization that because I felt abandoned by my mother during that time period, it affected how I interacted with other people. It affected how I viewed my relationship with other women. Because everything was coming from a place of, I don't want to be abandoned. I don't want to be rejected. And I was living my life that way. So it wasn't until I had this occur, that this came up, that this sprouted, that I was able to then work and remove, that I was able to see for myself, stepping back to see the bigger picture and say, this has really been affecting me in different ways. Now my perspective on that has changed because instead of being worried all the time that someone's going to leave, I'm going to be left alone, this is like a bad situation for myself, and not being able to step into that calm, now I can be calm. Now I can actually be present for the people whom I'm around in those moments. Because if it wasn't for the fact that I was feeling these abandonment and rejection sentiments within myself that I carried from a young age, if it wasn't for that, then I could be a better partner. I could be a better friend. I could be a better father, whatever it may be. And so that was what was presenting itself to me. And when I was finally able to let that load go, everything pretty much shifted. My whole life shifted.
That's incredible. I find it fascinating too, by the way, you can remember that far back because I know a lot of people struggle to have memory past a certain age. But I think that's very powerful that you discovered this pattern that happened throughout your life. What was there a certain pivotal moment, by the way, that led you to that discovery? Was there like a key factor, maybe a relationship or a place in your career where that, so to speak, kind of erupted in a more loud way to make you recognize it?
Sometimes it does surface its way like that, but sometimes it's more subtle. So the way this one popped up is usually through a train of thought. So when you sit in meditation, the idea that most people are familiar with is a thought shows up and you look at it and you let it go. And a thought shows up and you look at it and you let it go. That's your mind just trying to grasp at you. But sometimes what it does to grasp at you is it brings up something to say, hey, do you remember this? And in that moment, you kind of get jolted. And that's how it presents itself. And that's how it presented itself to me, is in those moments as I was doing my practices, it showed up and I said, okay, hold on. This is something major. And this is something that I need to look at. So it doesn't always have to be an event. And in my case, it wasn't a big event like a relationship or a breakup or anything of that sort. It was a remembering through that process where it said, hey, here's this, look at this. Oh, yeah, I remember that now. And that's how it showed up.
What was that like when you had that experience? How did that feel emotionally or physically for you when you had that big like, hey, here it is, when your brain did that to you?
Usually for me, when that happens, there's a little bit of shock because I say, oh, that's right. I forgot about that. So in the moment, I'm surprised. And then it's time to get to work. And once you get to work, then it's the emotions that come up. Then it's the sadness, then it's the grieving, then it's the tears in this case that comes out from that. And the thing that most people may not realize or understand is that emotions are a natural process. So in the Eastern philosophy, we look at emotions as you can think of currents. They rise and they fall, just like the flow of a river. It flows. So when the emotion comes, it needs to be released, not held in, not stopped. That means you have to feel these things. And so that's part of the work that I had to do is this comes up and I need to feel it and I need to feel it until it's out. If you built a dam against it, the water pressure comes up towards it and the water pressure will keep building and building and building and building until you decide to open the floodgates. Once you open the floodgates, you have to let it fully drain because otherwise you're still going to maintain some pressure there. You're not through it yet. And that's what that felt like for me in those moments. But after that process, shortly after, not immediately always, but it can be, then it's the clarity and the understanding of, oh, I understand now. This was affecting this. This was affecting this. This was causing me to act in this way. Because we pick up behaviors and beliefs from a young age based on the things that happened to us, just like I did. Mine was abandonment and rejection and fear of that. So then we're not really living in an authentic manner to who we really are. Instead, we're living based on, you could say, algorithms or scripts or programming.
That's really powerful for you to have that mindset because I know that, like you said, releasing that dam of emotions is really a big process when you have these experiences growing up. I know I share a lot with you on that sentiment that I do struggle with fear of abandonment, and I have in my life for obvious reasons. And what I'll share about that is just like you said, you have to really get to the core root of where that stemmed from. It's not always why you feel that, but it's what caused that to happen or what did you experience in your life before, what kind of patterns. And that's something that I love that you described as you were telling your story about noticing these patterns in your life. I know you said that a lot of times you would see those in relationships. Did you also see those in your career as well?
I would say that it was also present in the career because what better way to express fear of abandonment or rejection than to make sure that you're doing everything to stay in line so that you don't lose your job, so that you stay in that career path. So yeah, I would say that because I was not one to typically jump from location to location. I was more of a long-term steady worker. And so I would stay at one place and work as needed. And then if a better opportunity presented itself, then I would make the shift. But otherwise, it's I'm there and I'm doing the grind and that's my thing.
So, when you started to work on this healing path of fear of abandonment and rejection, what was that like initially for you in those stages? Because I'm trying to break this mentality in the grief community that somehow we can just recognize something and change overnight, and all of a sudden we're all better the next day. I know a lot of times healing doesn't work like that, and healing very much is a journey and a process of learning and adapting and making small changes over a long period of time. What was that like when you first started recognizing where this all came from and you started that healing journey? What was that beginning phase look like for you?
Well, the beginning phase really starts off, at least in this methodology, is I want to feel good. I want to be able to be healthy. I want to be in my body and I want to improve myself. Because with it, with the Eastern medicine, with the Chinese medicine, it's based on a Taoist philosophy. And in Taoism, we're concerned with flow. Now, your body moves and regulates in cycles and rhythms, and there are certain things that we do to enhance those rhythms to make sure that you're working optimally. Now, that process alone, by working optimally, is going to bring things up. You don't have to necessarily seek things. That's the wonderful thing, is it'll bring these things up. So let's give you a better example. If you have a beaver that built a dam, the beaver's still there, it's still maintaining the dam. But if you got rid of the beaver, the dam's not going to expand any further. So that would be the first step. But then the next step is, okay, do I remove the sticks? And if so, which ones? I don't know. I'm just going to look for sticks. An easy to remove stick? Great. If it's stuck in there, no. So we start just slowly removing sticks. And then this is where the magic happens because at a certain point, the pressure of the water itself will begin to push through, and that itself will remove the dam. And that's how these practices work. All you're doing is you're just seeking to optimize the environment. And by optimizing the environment and letting the body regulate and flow and move as it should, then it's going to start to notice these areas that are not functioning optimally. It's almost as if you shut down your computer after having it running for a really, really long time. It's going to get rid of the things that were hindering its process naturally for you. Now, it may present something to you like it'll say, oh, hey, by the way, you haven't done a virus scan in 462 days. Do you want to do that? And that's how these things present themselves. So you don't have to necessarily seek them out. They'll come up for you. But then once it comes up for you, now's the time to work on it. Because it's really interesting if you think about it. We have a memory of the event, and then we have a feeling and sensations of the event. Now, we might be able to logically rationalize with the memories of the event, such as in my example, I could have easily said, oh, well, she had to work, big deal. But I haven't processed those feelings yet. And that's the other aspect of it, is you can't just think about it, rationalize it, and work it through in your head. You have to feel. That's part of the grieving process, for example. You have to let those emotions come out. As I said earlier, emotions are like a flow. They have to flow out, otherwise they stay stuck in there. And what happens when you keep things bottled up, right? The pressure begins to increase. It's gonna burst at some point, but it's up to you if you want to release it or not, how you want to release it, and when you want to release it, because you could just let it build up and you could let it burst. But personally, in my experience, that has never led for me to having a fulfilling or even joyous life. We should be living in joy. I mean, if you look at little kids, they run around, they're joyful. Sure, something may happen, like they may fall and start crying, but even something as simple as dangling keys in front of them will stop the crying and cause them to change into a state of joy. So it's about finding that joy again.
I love your descriptions of how to move through emotions because I think that's something that is said a lot in the grief community and society as a whole is that emotions are something that we have to control all the time or suppress or, try to ignore them or let go. And I've always said that we can't consciously work on emotions. That just doesn't work because the body is what holds emotions. The mind is just a logic center to try to process them. But when we have that disconnect between them of trying to suppress them or ignore them, they do present themselves in different ways. And a lot of times, like you said, if you let those things bottle up enough, emotions can cause health problems to someone. They can go outward, by the way, and cause a reaction in your environment to a person, place, or thing. And that's where we're not listening to that emotion. And I've always said in my coaching practice, I've told people emotions are messengers. They're meant to tell you something. They can tell you something is not feeling right, something's out of alignment, something's off. They're meant to communicate with, not be controlled. And so I love that you also, by the way, shared a powerful thing that I could build upon on my own mentality about emotions is that example of breaking a beaver dam. Emotions are like that, by the way. We oftentimes have very complex emotions when we're dealing with grief, especially fear of abandonment and fear of rejection. There's multiple layers that get built with those two fears in particular. And so I think what you brought up was a very great idea, by the way, of picking away the easy sticks off of it at first, because eventually the water behind those or the big emotion behind it will push the other sticks out of the way for you. And that's where I think instead of trying to force or push or try to try to deep logic your emotions, really just learning how to peel those things back in a very slow way to let the natural flow of things push it forward for you. You don't have to force to find it. I think that's the really powerful message that you shared is we don't have to force this to come. It will come naturally for us. And that when that emotion does rise naturally, giving ourselves space to hear it, feel it, and understand it, I think is a very powerful way for us to acknowledge our emotions and use those to better ourselves to go forward.
Yeah, the concept of ignoring emotions, I like to equate it to taking out the trash. The trash can gets full. It's time to empty it out, but do you just leave it by the door? Because that's the same as ignoring the emotion. It's like, oh, the trash needs to be emptied. Well, maybe I'll just press it down and it'll last a little longer. Well, I can't really press it down now. Maybe I'll leave it by the door and not think about it. It's going to keep getting worse if you just leave it by the door because then the next bag goes there and the next bag goes there. And then you have the smell that comes out. What if the bag is ripped and there's fluid leaking all over the place? The only way is to take the trash and walk it out and toss it in its proper receptacle. So you can't just ignore these things because ignoring doesn't get rid of them. They won't magically disappear. It takes the work on your part to do it. And it's the misconception too, I believe, comes down to it's not the emotions that we have to control, it's our reactions. It's the
Mm.
reactions that people get confused with the emotions. It's not the same thing. Emotions are natural, reactions are not necessary. If I'm at the store and someone begins to yell at me for whatever reason and I get upset, it's not necessarily for me to yell back at them. That's the reaction. But I'm allowed to express it to say, hey, you know what? You're being very rude right now. Or like, what's the deal? What's the issue here? I don't have to throw punches, but I do have to express it. And that's what I think where the mix up is people equate the reaction with the emotion as being the same thing. It's not. The reaction's what's not necessary because that's based off these older programmings. My reaction when something happened in a relationship that was starting to lean towards you're going to abandon me is to try to remedy that. That's the reaction. So the reaction's what's not necessary.
I think that's really powerful what you brought up because I read a book recently by Dr. Joe Dispenza. It's called The Habit of Breaking Yourself. And he talks about this process trained to help people work through emotions and feelings to create changes that they want in their life. And something powerful that he shares in that book is that we oftentimes have an experience that creates a thought that then creates a feeling which then leads us to an emotion. And then our reaction is the very, very end of that. And like you said, reactions aren't always necessary or warranted, by the way. We don't have to. We get to choose when we react or how we respond to something. But I think what's really powerful that you've shared today with your own story is that when we do walk through that chain of logic and our experiences of life, sometimes there's an old story there that might not necessarily serve us today. And I think that's what's really powerful about what you've discussed with your own story about fear of abandonment and fear of rejection is that those stories were always there, but they were always guiding you in a lot of ways subconsciously or even on autopilot at times. And for you to recognize that it meant that you took a step back and said, where did this emotion come from and where was it founded? And then what kind of thoughts or feelings was driving that to cause that to happen? And I think the change that we can make with ourselves, because you're absolutely right, reactions aren't always necessary. They're just not. But because we run on autopilot a lot, or we have a strong enough story or strong enough experience in our past, a lot of times our subconscious will react to things without us even having a split second to think about why we do that or what's causing us to do it. It just happens on autopilot. And so being able to give ourselves what I like to call the minimal amount of space in a situation like that is to be able to stop ourselves and say, I'm feeling reactive right now, or I feel like I want to respond strongly. What's causing me to feel this way? What thoughts have built this thing into me? Do I have a power and control over myself right now to make a different choice or make a different decision? Or we can even ask ourselves on a deeper level sometimes, what story is driving me to respond this way? And is this serving me right now? Is this going to help my situation? I feel like you alluded to a little bit, and I was going to ask you that next part here as we move forward. When you finally started breaking away from the fear of abandonment and fear of rejection and started building this new story and these new ideals and mindsets going forward, what did that shift in the way you feel like for you when you started recognizing you were walking away from that old narrative and you were building this new story for you? that's propelled you forward?
If I had to sum it up in one word, I would say freedom. I would say freedom because that fear is no longer there. And I sat with myself when I had the realization that this was affecting this and all these patterns coming up in my life. So I sat with it and I thought about it. I said, was it present here in this relationship? Yes. Was it present here in this location? Yes. What about here? Yes. What about here? Okay. Then I asked myself, if I was in that situation today, now having removed what was holding me back, how would I feel? Would I still feel the same or would it have changed for me? And the answer that kept coming back with every single one that I checked in was, it's changed. I didn't care about that anymore. So it didn't matter what scenario I was in, but the fact that abandonment or rejection could be a thing in those moments, I didn't care anymore. It wasn't a thing anymore. So that's what I mean by the freedom is now I was allowing myself to be able to express myself as who I really am. And that was the beautiful part because it allows me to be present as, hi, this is me, as opposed to saying, hi, this is me. But when this happens, I become 3-year-old me because 3-year-old me's got this. He's handled this.
Mm. That's very powerful to say that because what you just shared with us today is that sometimes the younger version of ourselves has already mastered this, how to respond with our environment, but our new self is in that learning stage of things, in that adapting stage. And I think what you said too there is very powerful to understand in the grief process too, by the way. The person we are before we start our healing journey or we go through a grief situation isn't always the same person we become because of that moment. And so that person that we are changing into has to go back to the old version of ourselves and say, "Hey, I know you have this mastered and you found the way to go through this thing, but this isn't going to work here in the future. It's not going to serve us and give us the freedom that we're looking for." And so it's almost like having to in a sense, satisfy that little child and make them feel safe and heard, our inner child. And then this new person of ourselves, giving ourselves permission to have that freedom you just described, to walk away from those patterns and those beliefs that aren't always serving us and helping us in this new version of who we're becoming.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what it boils down to because too many people, too many of us, I was guilty of that too, and I'm sure I still am in some ways. We get into these situations that when something happens, we default to what was the first thing we did that worked for the situation. So as I said, like 6-year-old me will show up and say, I got this. I know how to handle this. This is what happened before. This is how we settle this. So then imagine for a moment if that was a tantrum, then you're going to throw a tantrum as an adult. The scenario doesn't fit anymore. So when you understand that that worked for me back then, but things are different now, the story has to change, the method has to change. You can't work on the same standard operating procedures anymore. Just because it worked before doesn't mean that that's what's best in the situation. You stick to it. And that's part of the growth process for people and moving beyond those things is understanding that, okay, here are all my operating procedures. These need to change. What they are right now, that's okay. Whatever it is, whatever got me here is okay. Because now I know my location on the map. Now, where do I want to go on the map? I know what the location is. So if I know where I am and I'm okay with that, and I know where to go, now I can carve out and create the path and change the things that are necessary in my life to get there. But it has to come with that understanding of I know where I'm at and I have to be okay with that. If you're not okay with that, you're not going to work through it.
Well, I think that takes a lot of people a lot of work. I know me personally and a lot of work I've done in my own life that when you run across those situations, it's being able to, the way I describe it is having self-awareness. I think it's the first part of things. And I don't say that in a way a lot of people use it, but I say it as a recognition tool to just be, as I like to say, be the observer of your life. I like to say that when you're in those situations where that 6-year-old self wants to come out and have a tantrum, like you said. Well, being the observer means you're going to see that. Whereas if you're in your own vision, acting it out, it's going to be a very different response to the situation. And so when you can step in that observership of yourself and say, whoa, I see that now, I recognize the situation, that response doesn't really fit anymore. And it's actually not going to get me what I want. If I go over here, though, and this is going to be uncomfortable because I'm not used to this over here. But if I give this a shot, if I try this, I might get the response I want. And I think that it takes a lot of willpower, a lot of self-control, and it takes a lot of self-awareness when you start that process of breaking away from 6-year-old self to stepping into your adult version of yourself because you're fighting so many beliefs and so many convictions and so many constructs of things. You might even be breaking away from what you've been taught or what you've been shown or what you've been guided towards in your past life and really stepping into that authentic version of yourself. And I love the word you used, freedom, by the way, because I do believe in a lot of ways many people are okay managing the chaos and the hardship of what was the past versus stepping into the unknown and uncertainty of who they can actually become. And I think that's a very hard reason why so many people stay stuck in those patterns. It's not because they don't want to change and it's not because they don't see the value of it, but it's that we've got such a hard belief system built in who we were. And the word that I just love to come back to that you said is freedom. Freedom does happen, by the way, when we give ourselves permission to question why we believe something or why we act and behave a certain way. What caused us to go there? What situation happened that led us to have this belief? I think when we get to that root place, like you said earlier, about, if we cut off a weed, it's just going to grow back. It's not going to go away. But when we get down into the core of that thing, into the roots, and we pull those roots out, it's no longer there. But what we can do is grow a new plant. And that new plant means freedom. That one means we take back our control, we take back who we are. We're able to make better decisions for us that give us the results we more closely desire. So,
Yeah, and that's where things like meditation, for example, play such a big role because it's training wheels for awareness. Sure, you could sit there and breathe and notice the breath, but it's when the thoughts come up, are you aware in the moment to say goodbye? Okay, goodbye. Okay, goodbye, because that's what it is it's practice. It's practice for when you're out in the world and you come into a reactionary state, or you begin to fall into that reactionary state that you can then say, hold on, step back. Okay, I don't need to outburst like this. And now you're able to manage yourself. But like you said, it comes from the self-aware state. And that's how you build that self-awareness. You have a methodology that's available to you that's training wheels to teach you to do this so that you can unload yourself and cut those anchors that are keeping you from trying to rise and reach the surface.
so I want to share the other half of the healing journey you've been on. What have been some of the big results that have happened since you made this shift in your life? Because it sounds like you identified the pattern, you identified the fears, you created that level of high self-awareness, you created changes in your thoughts, changes in how you respond to your emotions. What's that led to for you since you've done all that work?
Nothing more than a more joyous and fully authentic life. Because that's what it is you start to notice all these things bogging you down. Your focus is scattered, your energy's thrown in different directions, you're fatigued because, let's be honest, trying to swim with all those anchors would be really, really taxing. And it allows me to be happier because now, instead of being scattered all over the place with my focus, I can zone in on what matters and be present for it. And now, instead of being tired and fatigued all the time and having my energy being cast 462 different directions, now I can bring it to what's necessary, use it as needed, and I still have some left over for anything else that I really want to do. Because one of the biggest things was you come home, you do your work, and most of us were just too tired to do anything else. Like maybe you really love pickleball, let's say. And if you do, you want to go play pickleball after work, but if you're too tired to do it and you don't really get to play it, then how often do you get to play it? So it gives me a reserve of energy, it gives me a reserve of time and a reserve of focus. So now I can actually do the things that are aligned with who I am, showing up as who I am. And as a result, I get to live more joyously.
That's absolutely beautiful, Jose. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your story with us today. This has been a very powerful episode of the Empower Grief Journey today, and I love that you have shared your journey of going through fear of abandonment and fear of rejection to recognizing the events in your life of where those things occurred, where they happened, where that belief was found, and also reflecting back on your life of where that popped up and where that was causing issues for you. And then also making a big change of self-awareness and going after what you really wanted to create in life and being able to find freedom and more joyful states of life. That's a beautiful transformation journey of healing. So I just want to say a big thank you for you to coming on the show today and sharing your story with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Jose, I usually ask my guests two questions at the end of the show today. One of them is if you were to run into somebody who is going through grief or feels stuck in grief, what is one thing that you would share with them to help them navigate that journey just a little bit easier?
Well, if they're still stuck in grief, then to me that means that they haven't really grieved yet, or they're not grieving for some reason. So then the question is why? Do you feel that you don't deserve to grieve? Because if that's the case, then that needs to be worked on. You absolutely deserve to be free from that. There's no need to anger to that because grief exists for a reason. And as we said, emotions exist for a reason. It's a human event. You're not tied to the event, you're not tied to the emotion. Who you are at the core doesn't change because of that.
That's beautifully said, my friend. I think that people that are stuck in grief just aren't giving themselves permission to heal in the way that they need to. And they've got some anchors, as you brought up on the show today, some anchors that are holding them back. And sadly, those anchors are external. Those are things that their environments influence them and are not allowing them space to be in that authentic self that they should be. So I appreciate you sharing your perspective on that. I wanted to let you share with our audience today if they want to get in touch with you after listening to this podcast, is there a way they can connect with you?
Instagram is one method, and my tag is JMDCEM, which is Jose Mendoza, Doctor of Chinese Energetic Medicine. And I have a website that has some more information, rise2human.com. And if you happen to be stuck for whatever reason, whether you're stuck in anxiety or stuck in stress, then I have a link there where you could see for yourself how you could bring yourself back in or possibly schedule some time, and then we can work together to do that for you.
That's beautiful. Well, I want to let listeners know I will have all the links to Jose's website and social media in the show notes. So when you guys are done listening to this episode, take a look in that place and reach out to Jose. He's got some phenomenal teachings that he's shared. I visited his website personally, and he's got a lot of good information on there. Jose, thank you again for being a guest on today's podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And I want to thank all of our listeners for joining Jose and I today on this episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Jose's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, visit empowergriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can also find us on Apple and Spotify. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. You're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.